Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. And he will be talking to us today about some of the ongoing issues with the Office of Juvenile Justice, including the plan to move a group of young people to Angola. The Louisiana Center for Children's Rights provides legal representation to underage people who are in the juvenile justice system, including some of those who think that they might be moved to Angola. Mr. Clark-Rizzio joined the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights in 2015. Previously, he worked as Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Jason Williams when Mr. Williams was a member of the New Orleans City Council. Of course, now Mr. Williams is the top prosecutor in New Orleans. Clark-Rizzio was also a staff attorney for the Orleans Public Defender Office. He's a graduate of Vassar College and New York University Law School. Thanks, Aaron, for coming and talk to us.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to try to be loud enough, and if you can't hear me in the back, just raise your hand and let me know. My name is Aaron Clark-Rizzio. That's C-L-A-R-K-R-I-Z-Z-I-O, which I don't mind spelling out for a press club event. I have the privilege of being the now co-executive director of the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. I've been in this position for 6 years. LCCR, as we're often known, is a legal services nonprofit, and we support young people in the criminal legal system. We do that through direct representation and policy advocacy work. What that looks like is that we are the juvenile public defender in Orleans Parish. We have a contract with the state which allows us to provide those services. And we provide those services through a best-in-the-nation holistic model of defense, whereby we surround young people with multiple experts to help work on their team. A social worker, a civil legal attorney, a youth advocate, pair with the criminal defense attorney and the investigator to try to recognize all the barriers that that young person might be facing and ensure that when they leave the system, that they leave for good. We do policy advocacy work statewide, trying to push for a smaller system, a more humane system, and perhaps an effective system. We work also on the issue of juvenile life without parole. That is the harshest sentence that young people are still subjected to in this state, and we represent those individuals still facing that sentence. So that's what we do as an organization, and today I want to talk to you briefly focusing on the governor's plan to imprison children on the grounds of Angola Penitentiary. We are living in a moment where there is a well-founded fear due to lack of public safety. Louisiana, like the rest of the nation, has experienced an uptick in certain types of violent crime. And at LCCR, we believe, as a starting point, that everyone absolutely deserves to live in a community that's safe, healthy, and free from fear. That is why we approach the issue of public safety with the sense that the stakes are really high and we cannot afford to keep doing the same thing. The public narrative, though, often suggests that when crime is going up, that means that it's lenient policies that are the cause of those increases in crime, and therefore the only solution is to adopt harsh policies or harsher policies. And for far too long, when we fear for our safety, we reactively reach towards these policies, whether it's incarcerating children in adult facilities, prosecuting children as adults, going after parents, or simply just jailing more children at the onset at arrest. And I'd argue that the plan to move children to Angola is sort of part of this pattern of doubling down on failed approaches. Because whether crime is going up, down, or staying consistent, the things that we can do to promote public safety remain the same. We need to invest in economic opportunity, food, education, health care for everyone in our community. And for far too long, we failed to make these investments. So when it comes to the running of the Office of Juvenile Justice, we need to have this same approach in mind. A system of incarceration that relies on violence or threats of violence, which I believe the idea of moving children to Angola truly does, is just going to be a system that shapes children into enduring more violence and probably making them more willing to inflict violence at the end of the day. Instead, the Office of Juvenile Justice, I would argue, should be obsessively focused on working on policies, protocols, and changes in culture that can lead to the rehabilitation, the care for the health and well-being of the children in its custody. It should be learning from experts. In the face of staffing shortages, which we often hear from, they should be aggressively looking to release children back into the community where they can be better served so that they can focus their care on a smaller number of children. Yet instead, we're pushing forward with an ill-conceived idea of moving children to Angola. And as we've come to understand it, we want to house children in Angola who essentially are too hard to care for elsewhere or have been behavior problems elsewhere. The governor's plan is to move children to a facility on Angola in a building which is the building that formerly housed those adults sentenced to die at the hand of the state. That is, it was the death row at Angola. That is the building we're proposing to be used. It's equipped with cement cells and, barred doors, and these cells were meant to hold people solitary, on their own, inside. Now, the details of this plan have changed frequently, as have the motivation or the purpose for this. But it's important to keep in mind a few things when evaluating this plan. Between 81 to 85% of the children in OJJ's custody are black children. This is in spite of the fact that they only make up 39% of the population generally. So we have an overrepresentation of black children, and so any policy or procedure is going to disproportionately affect black children and black families the most. Every single child in these youth prisons is going to return to our community relatively soon. Whether it's 6 months or 6 years, they will be returning to our community. It is helpful. This should be the first thing we keep in mind when designing policies. Also, remember, Angola prison is the prison where we send adults only when they have long sentences or where we send all of the adults that have life sentences. So we don't even send adults to Angola if they have short sentences. When we know adults are coming home to our community, we don't send them to Angola. And yet the plan now is to create a way to send children to Angola. Over 40% of the children inside OJJ's custody are there for crimes like misdemeanor crimes, crimes we would characterize as nonviolent, and for violating probation. So again, this is not the population that should be subjected to the harshest punishment within any system. Lastly, things to consider. The whole purpose of the juvenile justice system under law is to rehabilitate. The whole purpose is supposed to be rehabilitation. Again, this is not my opinion. This is what we have all agreed upon as a state and a community. Angola has long been a place where we've sent adults when we believe they will no longer return to our community. So is this really where we want to be sending our children? As a place for healthy adolescent brain development, as a place for self-discovery and self-growth. The conventional story of sort of how we ended up here is that there was a series of fights and escapes from the Bridge City Center, which is a youth prison in Harahan, Louisiana, and that these were posing a threat to both the children and adults inside that facility, as well as the adults in the community around that facility. We were told that the building itself, despite long being used as a youth prison, was now insufficient for that purpose and could no longer be used as such. We heard local politicians in Jefferson Parish vocal about their desire to at least have these children simply not be housed in their parish. We were also then told, though, that basically the unrest in OJJ facilities boils down to some number of bad children or misbehaved children. And so these children sometimes were characterized as being beyond rehabilitation or at least not ready for rehabilitation. And so the idea is that if we can just remove these children from the rest of the population, that the problems will go away and that everyone else will be fine. And so this is where the initial idea came from, to house children on the grounds of Angola, at least until another facility could be built. Now, that quickly has changed, and now the plan is that we are bringing children from all the facilities that OJJ controls to Angola if they are misbehaved, or if their behavior calls for it. Now, the effect of this announcement became immediately clear. The threat of being moved to Angola sent ripples of fear through the children and families, so the children inside OJJ's facilities and their families. Children began calling our office and their parents to assure them they had not yet been moved, to ask their parents to try to prevent them from being moved. We heard of families setting up protocols where children would call every day at the same time so that they could tell their mother, "I have not yet been moved. I'm still here." The staff inside these facilities, we know, had to go around and assure children, "You won't be moved for this week. We know that." They would come around assuring children, "You're not one of the ones that's going to be moved. We promise you're one of the good ones." So we can already see how this plan is meant to work. Not only will some children live in Angola, but all of the children will live under the threat of being moved to Angola prison. And this seems to be part of the design. Again, this is no environment for rehabilitation. We know that this plan is not really about rehabilitation because the proponents of the plan have never made an argument for why this plan is good for children. We have not heard in all the shifting explanations for how we are going to best serve children in Angola. The plan is basically being justified by how it helps adults. The adult politicians in Jefferson Parish, the adult staff members inside the OJJ prisons, the adult community around OJJ prisons, and especially the adult administrators who are in charge at the Office of Juvenile Justice. Because before any of these adults can tell us why it's good to have children in Angola, they are struggling to answer basic questions for how children will get a baseline of care inside this facility. They're struggling to answer basic questions, such as the Office of Juvenile Justice already struggles with staffing. How are they going to staff up a facility on the grounds, in a remote part of Louisiana, on the grounds of a maximum security prison? It's a place that's challenging to commute to, and we already know it's going to necessitate these adults spending the night on the grounds of this facility just to do their work each day. How are they going to operate a school inside something they're federally and statewide legally mandated to do? These are children entitled to an education. How are they going to operate a school inside a building that doesn't have a schoolroom or desks or any facilities for education? They tell us that leaders from the Bridge City facility are going to now take over leading the education 200 miles away inside Angola. How is a school administrator who has a full-time job, and frankly, who is struggling in that full-time job at Bridge City, going to now be at two places at once? Going to now take on, presumably, a second full-time job of being a school administrator inside a maximum security prison, that is, Angola prison. Under federal law, children have to be sight and sound separated from any adults who are incarcerated at Angola. How are we going to house children at Angola while maintaining our legal obligations? Everyone in the state who knows anything about Angola knows that the whole care and operations of Angola are facilitated by the people incarcerated there doing that work. A recent expert went and visited the proposed building to evaluate it for children to be there. And when he stepped outside, he ran into a person mowing the lawn who was incarcerated there. And he asked, do you always mow the grounds around this building? He said, of course, we mow the grounds everywhere. We are the groundskeeping crew. Now, what the Office of Juvenile Justice has said is, well, we'll hire groundskeepers around this building. I go into detail here to point out what I think is the absurdity of this plan. The Office of Juvenile Justice is focusing on such things as they're going to have to figure out the perimeter around this building that a private contractor will come mow. So they're going to find the line at which their private contractor stops mowing, and then the incarcerated individuals inside Angola are going to start mowing. That's what we're trying to do, tying ourselves in knots, trying to have this facility operate. Lastly, OJJ has not explained how opening Angola to children is going to be any better the last time they tried to open a special facility for what they deemed were challenging children. Just last year, the Office of Juvenile Justice opened up St. Martinsville. Now, this may or may not ring true. You may have heard of St. Martinsville. You may not have. It'd be fair if you didn't. It is a facility that they opened in secret, without telling the public. The only way we did find out about it was our clients telling us, and when the media began investigating and insisting that we know the details. Those media stories revealed the following. This was a facility sold as the same that Angola is being sold, a facility for the most challenging youth who have behavior problems. When it was open, those youth were held 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. When it was open, those youth were not given any education. Not only that, the school board in charge of running the education inside that facility was not even told that there were children there they were responsible for educating. There was no programming for youth. So when that's someone's track record, and recent track record, I think they should at least have to explain why this way is going to be different. The problems inside the youth prisons really stem from the fact that prisons are no place for children. And therefore, we see these problems in all youth prisons. There's a lack of meaningful services. There's woefully inadequate education systems inside these prisons. And yes, there's violence, there's contraband, and there's escapes. The culture and morale inside these facilities is low, both for the children and adults, and it's reflected in the behavior of everyone inside. Opening a new facility will not fix these problems. If anything, the time and money we're spending on this is time and money we could have been using applied to fixing the current problems. Until OJJ prioritizes the health and well-being of the children in its care, the problems will simply persist. Without changing the policies, protocol, and culture inside these facilities, there is no building, there is no threat of violence, there is no amount of state troopers that are going to solve these problems. Lastly, I urge you to think of the message that this plan sends to the children and their families who are being threatened to be sent there. It sends the message that we do not actually think of them as actual children, worthy of our care, and capable of change. We know this because even if we were to set aside all of the economic, the legal, the practical, and the logistical problems that this plan has, it is not okay to send a disproportionate amount of black children to be imprisoned inside a maximum security prison, which was previously a slave plantation. This is land upon which essentially their ancestors were forced to labor and enslaved. That alone should be enough for any moral person to be opposed to this plan. The good news is we do not have to follow through with this plan. It is simply not too late. And organizations like LCCR are always going to be willing to work with the governor and OJJ when they prioritize children, when they act like the caring adults we know they are capable of. So that's what I hope they will choose, and that's what I hope the path forward is for the children inside these facilities and throughout Louisiana. A message being sent that they deserve supports, that they are capable of change, and that we expect to see them back in our communities living thriving lives. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to any questions. If I sounded like I was yelling, it's not because I was mad, I was just trying to be loud, but I am passionate about this.
Thank you. I could hear you.
Okay, good. Yes, sir.
So, bring me back up to date on the logistics at Jackson Correctional with weapons
Yes, sir. So the question was about a Jetson facility, which is a DOC prison facility, where there has been talk of could we utilize that for housing and caring for children who are imprisoned. I don't have all the details on the history of it, but broadly speaking, we know this used to be a facility where children were housed. It was deemed unfit for children to be housed there. It was not deemed to be a good facility for children. It then became used for women prisoners, I think out of necessity when there was flooding in a women's prison, right? And now one idea that came out of when people thought there were failings with Bridge City was, hey, let's just put them in Jetson. Let's put the kids in Jetson. I don't know if it's still being considered. I haven't heard it much being spoken about, but certainly there seems to be this array of ideas of, while we build a new facility in Monroe, where can we put kids? In Bridge City, in a new facility in Angola, in Jetson. I think all these ideas are being explored. I don't know the current status of Jetson, but again, I think it's focusing on the wrong thing. The focus seems to be on bad children in physical buildings, and I think that misses the point. I think you can put whatever group of children you want in whatever buildings, and that's not going to solve the problems. Yes, sir.
I don't know if everything that you're talking about is subject to legislation. Do you all plan some legislation to correct the situation?
Well, we don't plan legislation. We hope legislatures are paying attention and start thinking about this issue, and we certainly want to work with them on that. I think legislation impacts all of this. So St. Martinsville was open and children were being held 23 hours in solitary confinement. Just this past session, the legislature said, not again. We want solitary confinement to be used extremely limitedly. And so it begs the question, we're opening up a new facility where that's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging to house children there and not keep them in solitary. So the legislature has spoken. We need the other branches to listen and kind of, the legislator is giving plenty of clues on how we can better care for these children. I think they need to continue doing that. We need to look at how, what sort of regulations can we put in place? What sort of constraints can we put in place on the operation of these facilities? How new ones can be opened? That seems to be a problem. There is no certification or process for opening a new youth prison. If you want to operate a jail, a detention facility in this state, you need DCFS to actually come and certify that, yes, this is operational. There's no such equivalent when it comes to the operations of the Office of Juvenile Justice. We just need to look at that and look at what guardrails we want to put in place while still giving them the flexibility, to operate their department. But yes, I think there's ample room for legislation. Unfortunately, there's a lot of laws in place already, and we just need to make sure they're being enforced, right? The requirements to provide education are robust, and frankly, we're failing already in our youth prisons. It's just very hard to enforce those laws. And so it's a balance of more laws, but also enforcement of current ones, in my opinion. Sorry, yes, and then Julie.
Early in your comments, you referenced that you don't put together a team for a job. You mentioned disciplines or areas. So you used the term CASA, but it sounded like, do y'all have a relationship with CASA? And you bring them in, or do y'all do that yourself?
So CASAs operate in the slightly different system, in the family court system. We are the representatives of the child in the delinquency system. That's the more traditional criminal prosecution system. The children we represent are often in both systems. They could be the subject of a case around negligence or care and neglect. We just try to support the young person across all of the systems that they're involved in, and we know that the success of that young person is going to depend on their family, their community, and the institutions they're connected to. And so instead of just representing them in the courtroom, we want to also be connected to all of those people and institutions throughout the community, because that's the best chance we think that we have in supporting them in not being arrested again. Sorry, yes.
When Jetson was shut down, it it was shut down like in the middle of the night, and the kids were sort of dispersed, literally like overnight, and it caused a bit of a backlash. Like people were not happy that it was shut down without notice to, I think, even legislators. So I wonder, if you all are representing people who might be moved to this new building at Angola, do you expect that you guys would get notification? Because they haven't been very forthcoming about when this move might happen, assuming they can do it, that the federal court case might stop that. And I think there's a possibility that it might happen without any notice for security reasons. And so I'm curious about whether you guys get any notification for that.
Yes.
Like, when do you find out if your clients are with you?
Right. So, repeating the question, based on the track record of OJJ and the movement of children, there's many times where children have been moved and both family and attorneys are not notified. And that is still the case. There's no practice, there's no necessity, well, I would argue there's a necessity, but there's not a practice of notifying families or their youth's attorneys when moving children. We saw this when children were moved to St. Martinsville. And granted, there could be some circumstances where just prior to the movement or during the movement, OJJ would have valid grounds to say we don't want to communicate this information. The question, though, becomes once the young person is in the new facility, at that moment, I think there's no justification for lack of notice. And we know that the children, when they were moved to St. Martinsville, their parents were not notified. They were there for extended periods of time without anyone being notified. Literally, no one knew that in the community, at least, no one knew where that child was. And that does seem to surprise people. It's become such a normal part of our practice that I kind of forget to take note of it at times.
Do you envision the possibility of OJJ seeking injunctive or regional lawsuit if it comes to the first child being sent to Angola, or that would happen?
So I don't think OJJ will be suing anyone, but as was referenced, there is a lawsuit ongoing. A group of civil rights attorneys has sued to try to stop the movement of children because it seems so apparent that violations of the law will take place under this plan that we're asking preemptively to stop it. I say we, the community of people that I'd argue care about these children. I'm not party to the lawsuit. So that's happening. It's a tough legal standard. The law doesn't like to step in when people say this is going to happen. It's designed to sort of step in once the harm happens. Of course, the problem with that is when we say once the harm happens, what we're talking about is once children are harmed. And I don't think we should wait for that moment to evaluate this plan. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, wait.
I'm sorry.
You talked a little bit about staffing problems. How does OJJ's limited funding and funding struggles contribute to the current crisis?
Yeah. So the question was about the Office of Juvenile Justice's staffing issues and whether their funding or lack of funds is contributing to the staffing issues. First off, we'll say I am not a definitive expert on this. My understanding is OJJ is rarely, if ever, fully staffed. So even they're having trouble filling the roles which presumably they have budgeted for under their current budget. I don't know beyond that how much their funding issues affect their staffing. I think it is obvious, though, to anyone, right, that if you are facing staffing issues, if you are facing funding issues, why would you increase the number of facilities you would operate? We know any organization, any business, right? When mergers happen, they consolidate administrative staff. When you have multiple facilities, you have to have duplicitous positions, right? You need You need a superintendent of each facility. Fewer facilities, fewer superintendents. So when you have a staffing problem like this, it seems obvious that you'd want to decrease the number of facilities. Even if each facility is housing fewer young people, you're doing the opposite of taking advantage of economies of scale. And so in this moment, I know that the state and the Office of Juvenile Justice likes to say things like money is not an issue, and they say that as a way of saying they're devoting their time and attention to this problem, but that doesn't mean we should be illogical in how we spend money in this moment. Yes, sir.
Aaron, I hope somebody can ask this question, but I can't hear. I'm gonna stop there. What board, what elected officials, what organization, who hires you?
Hires me?
Yeah.
Sure. So we are appointed by the court to represent our clients in court. We're appointed by judges through the sort of indigency system, right? The public defender system says if you can't afford a lawyer, you're appointed one by the judge. We are appointed that. We are charged with taking that appointment through a contract with the Louisiana Public Defender Board. That is the board. It is the nominees to that are through various political and other sources contribute to who's on that board.
The money comes from the legislature.
The money then is allocated by the legislator to that board. That board is charged of statewide public defender services. And for our little corner of the world, we have a little contract that we take care of. Yes, sir. The Office of Juvenile Justice is actually a department that operates separately, but is technically within the Department of Corrections, of course. And all of that is operated under the executive, under the governor. And so the decision making around the Office of Juvenile Justice ultimately does flow to the governor. Yes, sir.
You seem to be very animated about the fact that they're moving towards Angola. Isn't everything you discussed really indicative of failure of the system in total? So that all of this Angola is a huge place. If you use the example of the school having a superintendent, it would actually almost make more sense to move them to one site, just like we do for Angola, for adults. And Angola used to be one of the most deadliest places in the nation, and that has been changed through psychology. So, you have a small segment of representing people legally, from the way I understand it, and you're really animated about Angola. Shouldn't your conversation be greater about Louisiana's failure in the total of this system?
Yes. So I spent 20 minutes today hyper-focused on the issue of Angola. I spend the rest of the year talking about what you're talking about. Absolutely. And I think that when it comes to Angola, I don't want to start from a place of trying to convince everyone to get on the same page as me or someone else on the efficacy of youth prisons or the morality of youth prisons generally or the efficacy of the juvenile justice system. I want to have those conversations. This is so acute, though, that I want to say, no, we need to stop this. However you feel about the efficacy of these broader systems, we need to stop this. I absolutely agree with you. The conversation we need to have on an ongoing basis is, if our goal is public safety, if our goal is to change behavior of young people, what is the best way to do that? And absolutely our current systems are failing. They're failing in doing it. And so we have to look at what they've used. They've used models of punishment. They've used models of incarceration. And so the question should become, why does anyone think it's okay to say they want to keep using those models going forward? Especially because we have increasing evidence of alternative models that work so much better, right? So often this is put as a false dichotomy between accountability and leniency, when in fact we have this wonderful path forward potentially where we can get accountability and efficacy. But that's only through keeping children in their communities, making them, those communities, healthy and strong, and making sure the resources are there for them. And so yes, I want to have that conversation at every other moment of the year. Today, I just wanted to be fixated on this one acute incident that is happening right now.
elaborate, please, on what you consider to be the perfect alternative to this?
Definitely don't have the perfect alternative, right? But we have some things that we could try. And when I say try, I mean invest in and give them as much of a shot as we've given our past practices. I'm looking towards restorative approaches. This is a broad set of approaches and practices which forces individuals that have done harm to come face to face and address that harm with the person that they harmed, and then to do things that would address that harm. Notice this is victim-centered. This puts the harm at the center. This can be done quickly and efficiently. And what we know is that this works for changing behavior. Our clients who have been part of restorative circles say that's the hardest thing they've ever done. Our current system actually obscures the harm done and rarely makes people face it. And so this is an alternative system that makes people face harm. Secondly, there's credible messenger and mentoring programs that we can invest in and expand. Credible messengers is just the idea that we all accept information better from someone who has a similar life experience as us. It gives them credibility. For our clients, we need to be focusing on who they find credible. It's people from their community who grew up in a similar way, maybe people who have engaged in the same behavior. If those people were working with them at every touch in the system and then back in the community, we know that there would be better outcomes. It's been tried. It's been tested in places like Washington, D.C. So there are these paths forward, and we can start small and then expand upon them. But we have to have a vision and a commitment to them as actual alternatives and not kind of do these head nods towards what people claim is progressive reform. And then the moment that, carjackings go up, we say, oh, well, that didn't work. Back to let's try more of the same.
There's not really a question before of a comment. I think sometimes people encounter this with lawmakers or confused about who goes into the juvenile justice system, and that there also might be some young people going into the adult system. So, some of the more high-profile carjackings that we've heard recently, I know some of these people are charged as adults. Can you explain, when that determination takes place and how some people get charged as adults versus end up in the juvenile system?
Yes. So the question is, when are children prosecuted in the juvenile system, and how do children end up in the adult system, which we know is possible? And then we have to separate this from where children are incarcerated, because that was the focus of most of what we're talking about. In terms of prosecution, very importantly, we as a state recognize that for all purposes, we consider children to be children legally up until the age that they're 18. However, maybe it surprised you to learn that up until 2020, that was not true for all children. We were prosecuting children automatically as adults as 17-year-olds. Now, the legislature changed that law. They changed the law in 2016. It was popularly known as the Raise the Age campaign or change, championed by bipartisan support and this governor. And it's a wonderful achievement, part of a national movement to recognize that we need to treat children appropriately no matter what harm they may have engaged in. Unfortunately, even that is being questioned in the current context. But right now, if you are under the age of 18, when you are arrested, you start in the juvenile justice system. That is, it is a civil legal system where you're charged with delinquency and the goal is rehabilitation. For certain crimes, and mostly for certain serious crimes, the prosecutor has the option of electing to prosecute you in the adult system. So we put the decision-making power in the hands of the prosecutor in virtually all circumstances. There's one caveat to that, but it's not worth getting into because it's so rarely used. Prosecutors around the state, though, are deciding which children they're going to prosecute as adults. Now remember, that doesn't transform these children into adults. It's just which children are we going to now treat in the adult system that was not designed for them and that does not center rehabilitation. For those crimes which are predominantly armed robberies and murders and some attempted murders, the prosecutor files some paperwork, a judge makes the determination of probable cause, the child is then prosecuted like an adult. When that child is sentenced, they're sentenced like an adult, so they can receive life sentences, they can receive sentences of decades in prison, and they go into the Department of Corrections, not the Office of Juvenile Justice. What research has showed over decades is those children are more likely to reoffend when they are released than equivalent children kept within the juvenile justice system. Nonetheless, we continue the practice today.
Just my parents can decide, so they want to vote. They want to vote for them. Clark's my dad, Rizzio's my mom. Yeah.